Hi, this presentation is about library funding, and it's exploring the evolution of how public libraries are funded in the United States. So, to start off with, the issue of public library funding can't really be separated from the development of public libraries. To better understand the evolution of how public libraries are funded today, this presentation is going to examine the development of library services for the public in the United States. They tend to go hand in hand. So, starting in about 1876, we know that in the United States there were over 80 different types of libraries. This included mechanics, a prison, medical, county, engineering, railroad, antiquarian, all different kinds, even sewing circle, church, university. However, we're going to focus on two major ones. So, in the beginning, we have the pre tax era. So this is before public libraries were really funded by taxes the way they are today. And the first type of library is called social libraries. Social libraries can be divided into either proprietary or subscription. Now, both of these had the same mission, which was for self improvement. So the materials that you would find in these types of libraries went along with that. They were mostly educational, they included history, theology, that type of literature, and they tended to be small. They had about less than 300 books, less than 50 members. Of course, there were exceptions, but generally they tended to be small. Now, proprietary libraries were also called joint stock because they had shareholders. The materials were owned by those who contributed. Subscription libraries, also called associations, are where the materials were not owned by those that contributed. It was more of a rental system. Now, when it comes to funding, they varied greatly because, again, proprietary materials were owned by those who contributed for shareholder use only. They were the only ones that could use it, and the fees were costly. So it was more suited for wealthy patrons. That's what you tended to see in proprietary libraries. Subscription, on the other hand, the materials were not owned by those who contributed. It was more of a rental system, and they paid a fee per given period. Typically, that period was about a year. And these fees were more modest because they were on a subscription basis. So it was a fee that most citizens could afford. I have a quote here from a researcher, Leach, in 2023 that says, "No doubt influenced by the precarious financial viability of the libraries, both types of libraries soon allowed non subscribers to use the collection once a set fee had been paid." So what this is telling us is that even though proprietary had its rules and so did subscription, in the end, it came down to they didn't matter if you were a member or not at the end. They just needed to keep generating that income, so they started letting non-members in. And some of the benefits that non-members could get would be they could borrow books or they could use the reading room. The other umbrella of libraries during this time period was circulating libraries. They were also called commercial libraries, and their mission was entertainment. Materials were mostly fiction, novels, and it was according to popular taste. It's what the public wanted. These were for profit, and they included a membership fee. But then we started to see a decline. So in 1875, there were 561 circulating libraries, and the number of public libraries began to increase in the later half of the 19th century. They basically began to put commercial libraries out of business because people were preferring to get their materials from the public library. It was free and they didn't have to pay for it anymore, so they did not see a use in paying for the circulating libraries. The decline of the social libraries took a little bit longer. In 1875, there were 2,531 social libraries. This is out of the about 10,000 libraries that were in existence in the US at this time. The social library had a slower decline. It started in the 20th century, and that went on for the first half of the 20th century before it just finally died out. And the reason for this is people weren't ready to give up the social aspect of the library. So, what started evolving were these hybrid social public libraries. They were formed. So in 1930, about one-sixth of the public libraries shared control with the Library Society. Nowadays, we have libraries that are just supported by a society, friends of the library, but at this time in the hybrid model, they are actually sharing control with the public library. These types of libraries were more likely to fail because when it came down to it, when they needed money, especially in communities that were experiencing difficult financial times and they couldn't get that funding from the hybrid model, they would have to close down, which was a great hardship for communities that were in rural areas or underserved areas. So then we start to see the tax supported era after we've left this time of highly specialized or commercial and subscription libraries, social libraries. We have public libraries as we know them today. So let's define that. They emerged really in the mid 19th century, but we didn't see as many of them. They were supported by taxes, governed by a board. They're open to all. They're voluntary. Anyone can go. You're not forced to go. You can go if you want to. They're established by state law, and they provide services without a charge. So these are kind of the defining characteristics of a public library. So looking at 1875, there were 399 public libraries across the US. So if you remember at this same time, there were just over 2,000 social libraries. So they were getting beat out. So they weren't as popular, but they were around. Only 7 of the 16 largest cities in the US had municipally supported libraries at this time. But they started to grow because cities and towns were expanding, increasing. Um, the immigrant population was growing. And also, we started to see state library commissions and associations that didn't exist before. So, funding today looks more like taxes, grants, fundraising, donations, library generated, such as fines. And we see that at the state level, the local level, or other, for example, library generated. And there were a couple of things that helped push this along during the second half of the 20th century. We had probably many of the libraries today owe their existence to the Library Services Act of 1956. It was the first major federal legislation to support public libraries. It provided federal grants to help states fund rural public library services. Now, this was first initiated in 1951. It took 5 years to pass. Um, Then they decided to update it in 1964. They replaced it with the Library Services and Construction Act of 1964. Now, the changes to this were it increased funding instead of just rural, now they were including funding urban areas and the scope widened. Now they're including salaries, wages, training for librarians, materials, equipment, just general operating funding. So we saw an expansion of the type of funding. Also, it made federal grants available for building libraries. And the Library Services and Construction Act kind of stayed in place until it was replaced by the Library Services and Technology Act of 1996. This was used to fund the support of use of technology, but also sharing resources and outreach to underserved or rural populations. Now, in between 1964 and 1996, and even after that, we saw amendments to the LSCA. We saw new legislations pass, but it was all in the same format where it's giving state monies and grants to fund the public libraries. And many of those amendments and acts are listed right here. The Civil Rights and Economic Opportunity Acts of 1964. We've got the Library Services for American Indians in 1960s. There was another one passed in the 1970s. There were some amendments done in the 1970s to the LSCA. The National Commission on Libraries and Information Science, 1970s, and the Library Adult Education Services in the 1980s. So during these years, there were more acts and more amendments. Many of them focused on bilingual education, adult education. There was a greater focus on minorities. There were attempts made to service underserved, or minorities during this time. So that's all I have for today. Thank you. And if you'd like more resources, here are the references that I used today.